Get officers to the skeel now. They've got him and the evidence.
Nobody in Hollow Creek knew that the ledger that would end Edward Grissom's career was already sitting 3 feet from his office, wedged behind a boiler, guarded by a one-eyed dog nobody wanted. They would find that out later. On the morning this story really begins, all anyone saw was an old man with a bad knee pushing a mop bucket down a hallway that smelled like pine cleaner and cafeteria tater tots, and a boy named Milo Anders trying to make himself small enough to disappear into a row of lockers. Walter Doyle had been the groundskeeper and part-time janitor at Hollow Creek Elementary for going on 3 years, and in that time, he had learned the particular rhythm of a school building better than he'd ever admit to liking. He knew which fluorescent tube in the second-grade hallway buzzed like a wasp trapped in a jar. He knew the custodial closet by the gym had a lock that stuck in humid weather, same as his own knees. He knew that Fridays smelled like pizza and Mondays smelled like disinfectant, because somebody always got sick over the weekend, and somebody always tracked something in on Monday morning. He had learned the school the way he'd once learned terrain, quietly, completely, without needing anyone to explain it to him twice. Before the mop bucket, before the name tag that said WDOYLE, maintenance in blocky embossed letters, there had been 22 years in the Army, the last 11 of them working dogs. Walt had gone in young and lean out of a logging town in eastern Oregon, and he had come out 58 years old with a limp, a hearing aid in his left ear, and a piece of shrapnel still lodged too close to his spine for any surgeon to want to touch. He didn't talk about Kandahar. He didn't talk about the detachment, or the deployment that had ended with a flash of white light and the smell of diesel and copper, or the 18 months of physical therapy that followed, or the review board that had looked at his paperwork, found a clerical error in his separation packet, and quietly reduced his disability rating from what the doctors recommended to something that didn't quite cover his blood pressure medication. He didn't talk about any of it, because talking about it didn't change any of it, and Walt Doyle had never been a man who wasted breath on things that couldn't be fixed by more breath. What he had instead of a pension that matched his paperwork was a single-wide trailer at the edge of town, its skirting rusted through in 2 places, parked on a half-acre his aunt had left him because nobody else in the family wanted the taxes on it. He had a wood stove that worked if you didn't ask too much of it, a recliner with a sprung cushion, and a cabinet with exactly 4 cans of soup and a box of instant oatmeal that he ate more mornings than he liked to admit. He drove a 04 Silverado with a check engine light that had been on so long he'd stopped seeing it, the way you stop hearing a clock ticking in a room you sleep in every night. He got up at 5, because his back wouldn't let him sleep past 5 anyway, and he was at the school by 6:30 most mornings, unlocking doors, turning on lights, making sure the heat kicked on in the classrooms before the kids came pouring in complaining about the cold. The job wasn't much, he knew that. Some mornings, standing in the empty gymnasium with the smell of floor wax and old rubber in his nose, he'd catch himself thinking about the men he used to lead through breach points in the dark, the trust they'd put in his read of a room, and he'd feel the strange vertigo of a life that had been enormous once and was now the size of a supply closet. But the school paid him enough to keep the lights on, and Principal Edward Grissom had hired him without much fuss 3 years back, which was more than most places had done, and so Walt kept his head down and did the work in front of him, because that was a soldier's habit too. You did the job in front of you, even when the job in front of you was replacing a burnt-out bulb in a hallway nobody thanked you for lighting. He noticed Milo Anders before Milo Anders ever noticed him. It's a thing you learn to do. Watching a room, you clock the kid standing alone at the edge of the blacktop, the one whose shoulders come up around his ears when a certain group of boys walks by, the one who eats lunch fast and alone so he can get to the library before anyone else claims the back table. Milo was 8 small for his grade, with a cowlick that never lay flat and glasses a size too big for his face, held together at one hinge with a strip of clear tape that Walt suspected the boy had applied himself rather than tell anyone they were broken. Walt didn't know the particulars yet, he just knew the look. He'd seen it on new privates who got singled out in basic, the ones who hadn't learned yet how to make themselves invisible, and he felt something old and protective stir in him every time he passed the boy in the hallway. And got nothing back but a flinch and a quick, apologetic half-smile, like Milo was sorry for taking up space at all. The dog came into it almost by accident, the way most important things in Walt's life had a habit of doing. It was a Tuesday in late September, cold enough that Walt's breath fogged when he hauled the trash out to the dumpsters behind the cafeteria before first bell. He heard it before he saw it, a low, ragged sound from behind the recycling bins, not quite a whine and not quite a growl, the sound of something trying to decide whether it was safe to make any sound at all. Walt set the trash bag down slow, the way you learn to move when you don't want to spook something, and came around the bin with his hands loose and open at his sides. The dog was pressed into the gap between the dumpster and the chain-link fence, low to the ground, ribs showing through a coat that might once have been a handsome brindle brown, but was now matted with mud and burrs into something the color of old rope. One ear was notched clean through, healed wrong, standing up at a crooked angle that gave the animal a permanently quizzical look. The left eye was clouded white, blind by the look of it, and there was a bald patch along the ribs where fur simply refused to grow any more, scar tissue shining pale under the gray light. The dog didn't bark. It didn't run. It just watched Walt with its one good eye, body rigid, waiting to see what kind of man this was going to turn out to be, because in its experience, Walt could see this plain as day, the way you can read fear in a body no matter the species. In its experience, men hadn't been reliable. "Well," Walt said, and his own voice sounded strange to him out there in the cold, rusty from disuse. "You look like you had a week." The dog didn't move. Walt crouched down, slow, knees complaining the way they always did, and didn't reach out. He'd handled dogs long enough to know that reaching for a frightened animal was the fastest way to lose its trust forever. He just crouched there, letting the cold seep through his coveralls, and talked low and even the same tone he used to use to calm dogs coming off a rough insertion. Half nonsense, half nothing, just noise meant to say, "I am not a threat. I am not a threat. I am not a threat." It took 11 minutes, Walt checked his watch after, because some habits from counting things under pressure never leave you, before the dog uncurled enough to let him see the collar. No tags, a leather strap, cracked and sun-bleached, buckled so tight it had worn a groove into the fur beneath. Walt didn't try to touch it that day. He went back inside, got a can of the good tuna out of his own lunch bag, and left it open by the fence, then went to teach a boy in his last class of the day should have been him, but instead he went to unclog a urinal in the boys' bathroom on the second floor, because that was the job in front of him. The tuna was gone by the time he checked the next morning. So was some of the dog's fear, apparently, because it let him get within 10 feet before it flattened its ears and pulled back toward the fence line. It went on like that for the better part of 2 weeks. Walt started calling him Tank, mostly because the dog was built low and solid despite the ribs, like something meant to take a hit and keep moving, and partly because Walt had never been a sentimental man and needed a name that didn't ask too much of him emotionally. He'd say the word flat, almost annoyed, "Come on, Tank," the way a man complains about a leaky faucet, and something in the dryness of it seemed to put the animal at ease faster than any coo or baby talk would have. Dogs know the difference between a voice performing kindness and a voice that simply decided, without much fanfare, to let you stick around. "I'm not adopting you," Walt told the dog on the 9th day, crouched by the dumpsters with a second can of tuna, the frost thick enough on the chain link that it crunched under his boots. "I want that understood right now. I got a trailer the size of a shoebox and a knee that sounds like a screen door. I am not in the market." The dog looked at him with its one good eye and made a low sound in its chest, something between a groan and a sigh, and shuffled 2 feet closer than it had the day before. "You're not listening," Walt said. "That's fine. Nobody around here listens to me either." By the 3rd week, Tank had a corner of Walt's tool shed, a folded moving blanket, and a bowl that Walt refilled twice a day without ever quite admitting to himself that this constituted ownership. He still limped on the back right leg, a stiff, careful gait that worsened in the cold, and Walt had started to notice other things too, the way the dog's head snapped toward any sudden loud sound, the way he wouldn't go near the school's delivery entrance when the propane truck came through with its hiss of air brakes, the way once when a group of kids came around the corner of the building laughing and shoving each other in that boisterous, directionless way children have. Tank had gone rigid and begun to circle, slow, clockwise, 3 full rotations before he settled again. Walt recognized that pattern. He'd seen working dogs do it before in another life when something in their training got triggered by a stimulus that didn't match the calm of civilian life. It wasn't random. Trained animals didn't do things randomly. Something in this dog's history had wiring in it that a stray mutt off the street simply didn't have. It was the pause that confirmed it. One morning, kneeling to check a small cut on the dog's front pad, Walt tilted the leg just so and caught the faint green-black shadow of a tattoo inside the ear, half obscured by scar tissue and matted fur, a series of letters and numbers, worn but legible if you knew to look for it, because Walt had inked plenty of them himself, years back, on dogs a great deal younger and considerably better fed than this one. He sat back on his heels in the cold dirt behind the tool shed and said out loud to no one, "Well, I'll be damned." That night, for the first time in longer than he wanted to count, Walt Doyle picked up his phone and called a number he still had memorized despite himself. Master Sergeant Ruiz, retired now, same as Walt, working part-time at the Kennel Master's office out of Lackland, doing exactly the kind of records work that a man's whole service starts to feel pointless without, picked up on the fourth ring, gruff and half asleep despite it being only 9 at night in Texas. Doyle, Ruiz said, once Walt had identified himself, in the tone of a man recalculating whether this call was going to be good news or the other kind. "It's been a minute." "It has," Walt agreed. He explained it plain, the way he explained everything. No decoration, the dumpster, the collar, the limp, the tattoo, reading off the letters and numbers as best he could make them out over a bad phone connection, and a dog that kept trying to lick his ear. There was a long pause on the other end, papers shuffling, the particular hum of an old computer fan Walt could practically picture from 3 states away. "You said his left eye's clouded," Ruiz said finally, "notch out of the right ear." "That's him." Another pause, longer this time. "Doyle, if this is who I think it is, that's a Malinois Shepherd Cross, retired out of a contract kennel, deployed with 3rd Special Forces Group out of Bragg, 2 rotations, Helmand and then Kandahar Province. Tag reads Blaze, designation A187, explosive detection, cross-trained apprehension. Handler was a staff sergeant name of Delgado." Ruiz's voice had gone quiet in a way Walt recognized, the particular flatness men use when they're about to say something they wish they didn't have to. "Delgado didn't make it home, Walt. IED, secondary device, about 4 years back now. Dog got pulled off rotation after that, should have gone into the adoption pipeline through proper channels. Paperwork says he did." A pause. "Paperwork's wrong sometimes." Walt sat with that for a long moment, looking across the dark yard to where Tank Blaze. He corrected himself, and then didn't, because the dog had earned the new name fair and square by now, lay curled in the shed doorway, one ear up, watching him the way he watched everyone now, waiting to see what kind of a night this was going to be. "Contractor probably flipped him for cash instead of processing the retirement right," Ruiz went on. "Happened more than Command ever wanted to admit. Dog like that's worth money to the wrong buyer, and paperwork's easy to lose when nobody's checking twice." He exhaled hard through the phone. 4 years, Walt. Wherever that dog's been for 4 years, it wasn't anywhere good, judging by the state you're describing him in." "No," Walt said, "it wasn't." He thanked Ruiz, promised to send photos of the tattoo for the record, and hung up, and sat for a long while on the cinderblock step of his own trailer in the cold dark, looking at a dog who had once walked point in front of men clearing compounds in Helmand Province, sniffing for the devices that would have turned them to red mist, and who had ended up, 4 years and God knew how many hands later, hiding behind a dumpster outside an elementary school in a town nobody had ever heard of. Waiting to see if this next man was going to be kind or cruel. "Blaze," Walt said, testing the name out loud. The dog's head came up, the ear that could still move, moved, and something in Walt Doyle's chest, some door he'd kept shut a long time, out of necessity, out of self-preservation, cracked open about an inch. "Yeah," Walt said, quieter. "Yeah, I hear you too, pal." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had asked for, and both of them, it turned out, badly needed. Walt started bringing Blaze to the school with him in the mornings, tucked in the cab of the truck, and the dog would wait in the tool shed during school hours. Grissom had signed off on it without much interest, waving a hand and saying, "Long as he doesn't bite anybody and doesn't leave a mess on the field, I don't care what you do with your strays, Doyle," and be there, tail thumping the packed dirt floor, when Walt came out at 3:30 to load up the mower or haul the last of the trash bins to the curb. In the evenings, back at the trailer, Walt fell into the old soldier's habit of routine, because routine, he remembered, was the only thing that had ever put a scared animal or a scared man back together. Feed at 6. Walk the property line at 6:30, slow on account of both their knees. Brush the matted places out of the coat a little more each night, working gentle from the edges in, because Blaze still flinched from anything that came at him too fast or from the wrong angle. It was during one of those evening brushing sessions, maybe 3 weeks in, that Walt found the worst of it. A long-healed scar along the dog's left flank, puckered and pale, clearly the track of a blade rather than any accident. And beneath it, when he parted the fur carefully, a patch of skin gone hard and shiny with old infection that had never been properly treated. Blaze went rigid under his hands, that same slow clockwise circling starting up in his back legs, even lying down, a tremor running the length of him. "Easy," Walt said low, both hands going still and open, no pressure, just warmth. "Easy now. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to hurt you. You hear me? Easy." He didn't touch the scar again that night. Instead, he sat with his back against the shed wall and let Blaze press his head, heavy and trembling, into Walt's lap, and the two of them stayed like that a long while in the cold, one broken-down old soldier and one broken-down old dog, neither one of them saying anything, because neither one of them needed to. It was 2 nights later that Walt finally cleaned the wound properly, warm water and gauze and the same steady murmuring voice, working slow enough that Blaze's breathing evened out under his hands instead of spiking, and when it was done and bandaged, the dog let out a long, shuddering breath, and for the first time since the dumpster, let his whole body go loose against the floor of the shed, asleep before Walt had even finished putting the first aid kit away. "There you go," Walt said quietly, watching him. "That's it. Nobody's coming to hurt you tonight." He noticed over those weeks how much of the dog he recognized in himself, and how much of himself he recognized in the dog. Blaze startled at loud engine noises, the same way Walt's hand still went rigid at the pop of a transformer blowing on a power line. Blaze wouldn't eat if there was a stranger standing too close, same as Walt couldn't sit in a restaurant with his back to the door. Blaze had a habit, when the stress got to be too much, of turning 3 tight circles clockwise before he could settle, and Walt, if he was honest with himself in the dark of his trailer at 2 in the morning, had his own version of that, checking the same locked door 4 times before he could convince his own body it was safe to sleep. They were, the two of them, running the same broken software, and there was a strange comfort in that, the recognition of it, a sense that whatever this thing was that had happened to both of them, at least now neither of them was carrying it alone in a room with nobody who understood. Blaze had a quirk, too, that Walt came to treasure more than he'd admit to anyone, a specific low chuffing sound, 3 short huffs through the nose, that he made not when he was excited or hungry, but when something in the environment had genuinely caught his attention, a kind of low-key alert register distinct from any bark or growl. Walt clocked it the first time Blaze did it at a squirrel on the fence line, chuff chuff chuff, ears up, body still, and again a week later when a delivery truck idled too long outside the cafeteria doors. It was, Walt realized, watching him do it a third time at nothing more than a school bus backfiring 2 streets over, the exact same alert behavior a trained detection dog used to flag something without breaking his handler's cover, quiet, deliberate, meant to inform without drawing outside attention. Somewhere under 4 years of hard use and neglect, that training had survived, buried but intact, waiting for somebody worth using it for. Milo Anders met Blaze on a wet Thursday in October, and it happened, like most good things in this story, almost by accident. The boy had taken to eating his lunch fast and slipping outside during the tail end of recess to sit by himself on the low wall near the tool shed, out of the sightline of the boys who liked to make him feel smaller than he was. Walt had noticed him out there 3 or 4 times without saying anything, because some kids needed to be left alone. More than they needed to be talked to, and Walt had learned the difference the hard way over a long career of reading frightened young people. But on that Thursday, Blaze, off his leash in the fence side yard, while Walt fixed a sprinkler head, ambled over to the wall on his own accord and simply sat down next to Milo, close enough that his shoulder pressed against the boy's knee, and looked up at him with his one good eye, patient, unbothered, asking nothing. Milo went rigid for a second, the way kids do around a dog that looks like it's been through something, and then, very slowly, reached out one small hand and laid it flat on Blaze's head. "Hi," Milo said, very quietly, like he was afraid the word itself might scare the dog off. Blaze leaned into the hand and made a low, contented groan, and Walt, watching from 20 feet away with a wrench in one hand, felt something in his chest go soft in a way he wasn't fully prepared for. "He doesn't usually take to people that fast," Walt said, ambling over, keeping his voice easy. "He's got a scary eye," Milo said, not unkindly, just observing, the way children observe things without the filter adults learn to apply, and his ears funny. He's had a hard life, Walt said. Doesn't mean he's not a good dog. Some of the best ones I ever knew looked rougher than him. Milo considered this with the seriousness only an 8-year-old can bring to a stranger's dog. What's his name? Blaze. That's a cool name. Milo scratched behind the good ear. Careful, the way you'd touch something you suspected was more fragile than it looked. I wish I had a dog like this. You got people at home who'd let you have one. Milo's face did something complicated then, a flicker of something that Walt recognized instantly, having seen it on 100 young soldiers over the years. The look of a kid carrying more than his shoulders were built for. My mom works a lot, he said finally. It's just us. She says maybe when things are more, he searched for the word an adult had probably used in front of him, stable. That's fair, Walt said, not pushing. Dogs are a lot of work. After that, Milo started finding his way to the tool shed most days during recess, and Blaze started watching for him, ears up, that low contented groan starting the second the boy's sneakers came around the corner of the building. Walt let it happen without comment, the way he let most good things happen without comment, on the theory that naming a good thing too loudly was the surest way to scare it off. It was on one of those afternoons, the two of them, man and boy, sitting on the low wall with the dog stretched out between them in a thin patch of October sun, that Milo told Walt, in the flat, matter-of-fact way children sometimes report the worst things happening to them, about Tyler Grissom. He says I smell like a garage sale, Milo said, picking at a loose thread on his backpack strap. And he took my lunch money twice, and Ms. Petricelli said she'd talked to him but nothing happened. Grissom, Walt repeated, any relation to the principal? His son, Milo said, like this explained everything, which, as Walt would come to understand, it very much did. Walt didn't say much in response that day. He'd learned a long time ago that a kid telling you something hard didn't need a speech. He needed to know somebody had heard him and wasn't going to make it worse. He just nodded and let Blaze shift closer to the boy and said, nobody gets to make you feel small on my watch, you understand? You come find me if it gets bad. Milo looked at him for a long moment, and something in his face eased, just slightly, the particular relief of a kid realizing an adult was actually listening. Okay, he said. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday in November, gray and sharp cold, the kind of day that smells like the first hard frost of the year. Walt had let Blaze off-leash in the fence side yard during the lunch recess, same as he did most days now, trusting the fence line and the dog's own good sense to keep him out of the main play yard. But a gate latch had been left loose by a delivery crew that morning, and Blaze, following some scent or simply curious about the noise of 40 children shrieking on a playground, had wandered through the gap and out toward the edge of the blacktop where the older kids played foursquare. Tyler Grissom was 11 years old, big for his grade the way some kids get big before they get patient, and he did not like being startled, and he especially did not like being startled by an ugly one-eyed stray dog wandering uninvited into his foursquare game in front of an audience of his friends. Get out of here, Tyler said, and shoved Blaze hard with the flat of his sneaker, catching the dog square in the ribs on the same side where the old knife scar still lived under the fur. Blaze yelped a real yelp, sharp and startled and hurt, and scrambled backward, and Tyler, embarrassed. Dee, now in front of the boys watching, drew his foot back and kicked again, harder, catching the dog's back leg, the same leg that had never healed quite right. It was Milo who saw it happen from across the yard, and Milo who came running, small and furious in a way his own body seemed surprised by, shouting for anyone to stop. And it was the playground aide, Ms. Petricelli, who got there next, hauling Tyler back by the shoulder while Blaze cowered against the chain-link fence, trembling, that low involuntary circling starting up again, 3 tight clockwise turns before he could even try to stand. Walt heard the commotion from across the yard where he'd been fixing a loose downspout, and something in him, some old reflex from another life entirely, the part of him trained to move fast and calm toward the sound of trouble rather than away from it, had him across the blacktop before he'd consciously decided to move at all. He found Blaze pressed against the fence, favoring the back leg badly, panting hard and fast, eyes rolling with a fear Walt hadn't seen in him since that first week behind the dumpster. Walt went down on one knee in front of him, slow, hands open, same as always, and said low, I'm here, I got you, and felt the dog's whole body shudder once hard and then begin, very gradually, to still. It was only after Blaze had settled enough that Walt trusted himself to stand and turn around that he let himself feel the anger, and it came up in him cold and controlled rather than hot, the particular fury of a man who has spent a career learning not to act on fury until he's assessed the whole situation. He kicked him, Walt said to Ms. Petrocelli, and his voice was very quiet, which anyone who'd served with him would have recognized as considerably more alarming than shouting. Twice, she said, tight-lipped, clearly furious herself. I saw the second one. Tyler, you go straight to the office right now. Tyler, to his credit or perhaps simply his fear, went pale and quiet and walked off toward the building without argument, and Milo stood there next to Walt with his fists still clenched at his sides, looking like he wanted to say something enormous and didn't have the words for it yet. He's a good dog, Milo said finally, fiercely, like this was the only defense that mattered. He didn't do anything. I know it, Walt said, and put a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. I know it, son. Thank you for coming to get somebody. The office, when Walt brought the incident report in that afternoon, with Blaze's limp freshly documented by the school nurse, and a note about the dog's back leg from a vet visit Walt had squeezed in during his lunch break, turned out to be considerably less satisfying than the moment on the blacktop had promised. Principal Edward Grissom was a tall man with a good haircut and a handshake that lasted a beat too long, the kind of man who'd built a career on sounding reasonable in rooms where nobody checked his math. He listened to Walt's account with his hands folded on the desk, and his face arranged into an expression of grave concern that didn't quite make it to his eyes. I hear you, Mr. Doyle, I do, Grissom said, but I have to be honest with you, that dog shouldn't have been loose on school grounds in the first place. There's real liability there, you understand, if it had been a child that dog bit instead of the other way around. He didn't bite anybody, Walt said, keeping his voice level with an effort that cost him more than it should have. Your son kicked him, twice, there's a witness. And Tyler's going to be spoken to, Grissom said smoothly. I've already had a word with him, but I think going forward it's probably best if the dog stays home, for everyone's safety. I'm sure you understand. Walt understood plenty. He understood that a man who could look him dead in the eye and turn a documented assault on an animal into a liability conversation about the animal was a man who'd had a great deal of practice making inconvenient truths disappear, and that particular skill set was the kind Walt had learned, over a long career, to be very suspicious of. He didn't argue further that day. He said, understood, in a voice that gave away nothing, and left the office, and went and sat with Blaze in the truck for a long while before he trusted himself to drive. It was 2 weeks later, mopping the hallway outside the front office on a Friday evening after the building had emptied out, that Walt first noticed the ledger. He wasn't looking for anything. That was the truth of it, and he'd say so later, under oath if it came to that. He wasn't investigating. He wasn't snooping. He was doing his job, and his job that evening involved moving a rolling supply cart out of the maintenance closet that backed onto the boiler room, a closet that shared a thin wall with the front office's file storage. The cart had gotten jammed against a stack of banker's box. That had clearly been shoved back there in a hurry, out of the way, not properly labeled or shelved the way the rest of the district's paperwork was, and when Walt shifted the top box to free the cart, its lid slid sideways and a spiral-bound ledger slid out onto the concrete floor, along with a scatter of receipts. He picked them up to put them back. That was all it was, at first, tidiness, the old habit of a man who couldn't stand to leave a mess behind him, and it was only because one of the receipts landed face up in the light from the closet's bare bulb that he saw the number on it. $12,000 made out to a vendor called Grissom Recreational Supply for playground equipment that Walt, who had personally inventoried and maintained every piece of playground equipment on the property for 3 years running, knew for a stone-cold fact did not exist. He sat with that for a long moment, crouched on the cold concrete, looking at a receipt for equipment he'd never seen delivered, made out to a company whose name matched his principles a little too closely to be coincidence. Blaze, who'd been lying by the door waiting for him the way he always did during Walt's after-hours work, lifted his head and made a low sound, not the chuff-chuff of casual alert, but something deeper, more insistent, ears pinned slightly back, and got up and pressed his nose against the stack of boxes, tail low, body tense in a way Walt recognized instantly from a dozen compounds cleared a lifetime ago. It was the posture of a dog that had found something, plain and simple, Whether the something was a buried device or a stack of fraudulent paperwork, the alert was the same. This matters, handler, pay attention. Yeah, Walt said quietly, looking at the receipt in his hand. I see it too. He didn't take anything that night. He put the boxes back exactly as he'd found them, photographed what he could with his phone before he did, and drove home in the dark with his jaw tight, and his mind moving the way it used to move on missions, methodically, without panic, building a picture one piece at a time. Over the following weeks, Walt did what he'd been trained to do a very long time ago in a very different context. He watched, he documented, he kept his own counsel, and he moved slowly enough not to spook anyone into destroying evidence before he had enough of it to matter. He noted which vendor names repeated on invoices he glimpsed during his evening rounds. He noted that the school's PE equipment budget had, according to a parent newsletter he found in the recycling, supposedly funded new playground structures, new gym mats, a full replacement of the aging basketball hoops, none of which Walt, who maintained every inch of that equipment personally, had ever seen arrive. He noted with a cold, still sort of anger, that the special education program's promised sensory room, funded 2 years running according to the district's own public budget reports, remained an empty storage closet with a hand-lettered sign taped to the door that said Future Sensory Room, coming soon, the tape yellowed with age. And he made one more call to an old contact, this one not from the kennel world but from further back, a man named Curtis Alvarez, who'd served with Walt's unit as an intelligence analyst and now worked, in his considerably quieter civilian life, as a forensic accountant specializing in nonprofit and public sector fraud. Send me what you've got, Alvarez said, once Walt had explained the situation over a bad connection from the parking lot of the school, Blaze's head resting heavy on his knee through the open truck window. Photos, names, dates, whatever you photographed. I'll tell you if it's actually something or if you're seeing ghosts. It took Alvarez 4 days to call back, and when he did, his voice had the particular flatness of a man who'd found exactly what he was afraid he'd find. Grissom Recreational Supply doesn't exist as a real vendor, Walt, Alvarez said. No business license, no tax ID that matches anything legitimate. But I did find a DBA filing 3 years back under a name that traces back to Edward Grissom's younger brother, Marcus. Same address as Edward's house, incidentally. A pause, papers shuffling on his end. And there's something else you should know, since you told me you served with the 3rd out of Bragg back in the day. Marcus Grissom, before he apparently got into the fake school supply business, used to run procurement for a private contractor called Meridian Field Logistics. You remember them. Walt went very still in the driver's seat. He remembered them. Everybody who'd served in that theater in that window of years remembered Meridian Field Logistics, because Meridian Field Logistics was the contractor that had supplied a batch of substandard, likely counterfeit mine detection equipment to several forward operating bases, equipment that had failed to properly flag a buried device outs. Eyed a compound wall in Kandahar province on a night Walt still saw sometimes with his eyes open, a night that had ended with 2 men dead, and Walt himself carrying a piece of casing in his back that no surgeon would ever fully remove. The contractor had settled the resulting lawsuits quietly, admitted no wrongdoing, and largely disappeared from public Chinese letter after a Pentagon Inspector General report that had gotten a few paragraphs of news coverage and then vanished from public attention entirely. Marcus Grissom, Walt said slowly, was procurement lead for Meridian. For about 2 years, yeah, left right around the time the IG report dropped. Nothing ever stuck to him personally. Companies like that are built to let the guy at the top walk clean, while the business itself just quietly dissolves and reappears somewhere else with a new name. Alvarez's voice was careful now, gentler than before, the voice of a man who understood he'd just handed his old friend something considerably heavier than a fraud case. You okay, Walt? Walt looked out the windshield at the school building, lit gold in the last of the afternoon sun, and at Blaze, whose good ear had come up, sensing something in the stillness of the man beside him. I'm okay, Walt said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that it was mostly true. The anger in him had gone quiet and cold and entirely purposeful, the particular clarity he remembered from the good years, when there was a problem in front of him that could actually be solved by careful, patient work rather than simply endured. Send me everything you've got in writing. I want it all documented before I do anything else. He spent the following 10 days building the case the way he'd once built a target package, methodically, cross-referencing everything, keeping copies in 3 separate places, timing his movements around the school so as never to seem like he was doing anything other than his ordinary rounds. He photographed more invoices. He got a formal, dated statement from Ms. Petricelli about the incident with Tyler and the dog, which turned out to matter for reasons he hadn't initially anticipated, because it established a documented pattern of Principal Grissom minimizing serious problems to protect his own family's interests. A pattern Alvarez said would matter a great deal to a school board weighing the credibility of a fraud accusation against a sitting principal. He spoke carefully and without tipping his hand to 2 other parents whose children had also complained about missing equipment or unaddressed bullying, and found, unsurprisingly, that he was not the only person in Hollow Creek who'd noticed something was wrong and simply hadn't had anywhere solid to bring it. It was on the 11th night, working later than usual to finish photographing a final batch of invoices he'd need before he felt ready to take the whole matter to the district superintendent, that things went sideways. Walt had let himself into the building using his own set of keys, same as any other evening, Blaze padding along beside him in the dark, quiet, alert, that familiar clockwise circle nowhere in evidence because the dog, by now, trusted this building and this routine completely. They'd gotten as far as the hallway outside the front office when Blaze stopped dead, ears sharp forward, body gone rigid in a stillness Walt hadn't seen from him since the earliest days behind the dumpster. And then, low and insistent, came the sound. Chuff, 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 3 sharp huffs through the nose, the alert Walt now knew as well as he knew his own heartbeat. Walt went still too, old training taking over before conscious thought caught up, and listened. There was a light on in the front office that shouldn't have been on at 8:30 at night, and beneath the door, the particular rhythmic grinding hum of a paper shredder running continuously, not in the ordinary stop-start way of someone clearing out a day's junk mail, but steadily, the sound of someone working through a substantial stack of documents with real purpose. Walt's mind ran the calculation fast and cold. Someone had gotten wind, somehow, that questions were being asked, and someone was destroying the evidence before Walt could finish building his case. He didn't rush the door. That wasn't how you moved toward an unknown threat, not if you'd learned anything at all in 22 years of doing it professionally. He moved to the side of the frame, out of the direct sightline through the door's narrow, reinforced window, and looked in and saw Marcus Grissom, a heavier, grayer version of his brother, but the resemblance was unmistakable, bent over the office shredder with an armful of folders, feeding them through steadily, methodically, the floor around him littered with confetti strips of what had, until moments ago, been documentation. Walt weighed his options with the same flat, unhurried clarity he'd once applied to considerably more dangerous calculations. He could call the police immediately and likely lose most of the remaining physical evidence before anyone arrived. He could confront Marcus directly and risk an escalation he had no backup for. Or he could do what he'd actually trained a lifetime to do, which was to secure the scene calmly, minimize risk to himself and everyone else present, and let the evidence he'd already gathered do the heavy lifting, rather than turning this into something it didn't need to be. He called the police first, quiet, using the flashlight function on his phone rather than turning on the hallway lights, giving the dispatcher the address and a calm, precise account of a break-in in progress. Then, because the shredding was still going, because every additional minute meant more evidence gone for good, he made the harder call. He knocked on the door 3 times unhurried and said, in the same flat, carrying voice he'd once used to call out a breach order, "Marcus Grissom. Police are on their way. Step away from the shredder." The sound inside stopped, a long, taut silence. Then the door was flung open hard, catching Walt across the shoulder, and Marcus Grissom came through it fast, folders still clutched in one hand, shoving past with the particular clumsy desperation of a man who has never had to physically fight for anything in his life and is discovering in real time that he doesn't know how. What happened next took less than 15 seconds, though it would feel considerably longer in the retelling, the way these things always do. Walt didn't throw a punch. He didn't need to. 22 years of close quarters training had left him with something more useful than aggression, the calm, economical ability to control a body without damaging it unnecessarily. He caught Marcus's shoved arm, redirected the momentum rather than fighting it, and used the man's own forward motion to bring him down onto one knee against the wall, controlled, firm, no more force than the situation required. It was, if anyone had been watching with a professional eye, a textbook restraint, the kind taught in exactly the training pipeline Walt had spent a career both learning and later instructing. Blaze, for his part, did not bite. He didn't need to. He simply placed himself, low and solid, directly between Marcus Grissom's scrambling legs and the office door, blocking the exit with his full body weight, teeth bared just enough to communicate the seriousness of the situation without ever making contact. A trained apprehension posture that held a man in place through presence and implied consequence rather than violence. It was, Walt would reflect later, exactly the kind of controlled, non-lethal hold Blaze had almost certainly been trained to execute a lifetime ago, in a country half a world away, on men considerably more dangerous than a soft-handed embezzler with a folder full of shredded evidence. "Don't move," Walt said quietly, kneeling with one knee planted between Marcus's shoulder blades. Not enough pressure to hurt, plenty enough to communicate that moving further was not a good idea. Dog doesn't like it when people move fast. Neither do I, at this point in my evening. Marcus Grissom, to his credit, did not move. The police arrived within 6 minutes. Hollow Creek was a small enough town that 6 minutes counted as fast, and found the scene largely as Walt had left it. One man restrained and cooperative, one dog standing calm sentry, one janitor sitting on an overturned trash can looking, by his own later admission, considerably more tired than triumphant. The surviving, unshredded documents, along with the photographs Walt had already taken, and the file Curtis Alvarez had built from a state away, gave the investigating officers more than enough to secure both a search warrant for the remaining district financial records, and within the week, formal fraud charges against both Grissom brothers. The unraveling, once it started, went fast, the way these things tend to once the first thread comes loose. Edward Grissom was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours pending the district's own investigation, and resigned outright 2 weeks later rather than face the school board hearing that had already been scheduled, at which Walt, Ms. Petrichelli, and 2 other parents had all agreed to testify. The state auditor's office, brought in at the superintendent's request, eventually traced just over $91,000 in misappropriated funds across 3 fiscal years, siphoned through the fake vendor account into Marcus Grissom's personal accounts, and from there, into a chain of gambling debts that Edward had apparently been helping his brother cover in exchange for a cut. The sensory room, funded twice over on paper and never built even once, became, within a month of the story breaking, the subject of an emergency PTA fundraiser that raised more in 3 weeks than the missing money would have cost to FI. Exit properly in the first place, a fact the local paper found irresistibly ironic, and printed on the front page, beneath a photograph of Walt and Blaze standing in the school's front hallway. The formal reward, when it came, arrived in the shape the district superintendent clearly expected Walt to want: a letter of commendation, a modest check from a community foundation grateful for his diligence, an offer made with genuine warmth of a full-time facilities director position with benefits that would have, at long last, more than covered the medications his own disability rating never quite stretched to. Walt took the job because a man's got bills same as anyone, and it felt good, if he was honest with himself, to be trusted with something bigger than a mop bucket again. But when the local paper asked him, standing in that same front hallway with Blaze leaning warm against his leg, what the whole ordeal had meant to him, Walt thought about it for a long moment before he answered, the way he thought about most things worth answering carefully. "Money's fine," he said. "Money helps, but you want to know what actually matters here. There was a dog nobody wanted, doing a job nobody remembered he was trained for, and there was a kid getting picked on that nobody in charge was willing to protect. Fixing that, that's the part that matters. Everything else is just paperwork." Milo Anders, for his part, got a dog. Not right away. These things take the time they take, and Walt understood better than most that trust, once broken, has to be rebuilt slow and deliberate, same for an 8-year-old boy as for a scarred-up former military working dog. But 6 months later, once Milo's mother had settled into her new schedule at the hospital where she'd finally landed a day shift position, and once Walt, newly promoted, considerably less broke, and with a spare room in a slightly larger rental he'd finally allowed himself, had got to know the family well enough to trust the fit, a scruffy, one-eyed rescue named Pepper, found at the same county shelter that had eventually taken in 3 of Blaze's littermates from an unrelated case. Came home to live with Milo and his mother on a quiet street 2 blocks from the school. Tyler Grissom, stripped of his father's protective cover and required, as part of the district's resolution with the family, to complete both a formal apology and a semester of supervised community service at the local animal shelter, turned out to be considerably less of a villain and considerably more of a scared, poorly parented kid than anyone had given him credit for being. He and Milo did not become friends exactly, not right away, but by spring they had reached the particular détente that sometimes happens between former enemies who have both had a hard year, and once in April, Walt saw the two of them standing together at the fence line during recess, taking turns tossing a tennis ball for Blaze, and said nothing about it to anyone, because some good things are better left uncommented on, same as always. As for Walt and Blaze themselves, the ending was quieter than any of it, and truer for being quiet. Most evenings now found them on the porch of Walt's newly weatherproof trailer. He'd fixed the skirting himself, first project with the extra pay, Walt in a chair that had finally replaced the one with the sprung cushion, Blaze stretched long across the boards at his feet, both of them watching the sun go down over a half-acre that had, slowly and without any particular ceremony, become something closer to a home than either of them had expected to get. "You did good," Walt told him one evening, scratching behind the good ear the way he had 1,000 times by now, the crooked notched one twitching in what Walt had come to recognize as pure contentment. "Both of us did, I suppose. Didn't think that was still in the cards for either one of us." Blaze let out that low, familiar groan, chuff, 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 quiet and satisfied, and closed his one good eye, and Walt Doyle, veteran, groundskeeper, reluctant hero of a story he'd never asked to be part of, sat there in the last of the light and let himself, for once, simply feel at peace. If this story moved you, do us a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps small channels like ours keep telling stories about the veterans and the dogs who deserve to be remembered. Subscribe if you want more stories like Walt and Blaze's. Drop a comment and let us know what part hit you hardest. And if you know someone who could use a story like this one today, go ahead and send it their way. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.